RC cars are very sensitive to the changes we make to them. One screw move from one spot to another can dramatically change how your car can drive. In this video, we'll be going over some more advanced tuning options to help you fine-tune how your car drives. I already made 2 videos talking about tuning regarding to overlooked tuning options and basic tuning necessities, so if you want to watch those, be sure to check them out in the description. Like before, I'll mainly be going over 8th scale e-buggy and by extension e-truggy, so no nitro changes or anything like that. Before we begin, I'd like to thank this channel sponsors A-Main Hobbies, Cow RC, RC Trophy Chasers, and Peach State Hobbies. Anything you guys purchase using those links in the description below will directly support me as well. With that out of the way, why don't we get started? Since we left off with shocks in the last video, why don't we talk a little bit about shock caps, specifically the shock caps you can get in 8th scale racing being emulsion shock caps and bladder shock caps. Currently, I have emulsion shock caps in my MX-8E e-buggy and MP10TE e-truggy, so why don't we talk about those first. Emulsion shock caps, to put it in layman's terms, allow for the oil and air to mix inside the shock body. What this basically does is cause the shock to feel a little bit softer compared to a bladder shock with the same viscosity of oil. If you want to know if you have an emulsion shock cap, be sure to check to see if you have a bleed screw on the top of your shock cap, and also see if you have a full rubber bladder on the inside of the shock cap itself. Emulsion shock caps tend to do best on bumpy, rutted out tracks that are usually better for less experienced builders, as they are very easy to set up for the same for each shock. Bladder shock caps, on the other hand, use a rubber diaphragm to separate the oil from the air to keep the shock movement as consistent as possible. Most of the time you'll see bladder shocks on cars that need the consistent shock movement on long nitro mains or on smoother tracks with a lot of traction. The only real downside to bladder shocks is that building a bladder shock consistently is a bit more difficult compared to an emulsion shock. Not by much, but just enough to require a bit more attention. This tuning option is a bit more subjective in what you want your car to feel like and what you need your car to go through. It's best to experiment with these 2 options and see what will work for you. The last thing I want to go over when it comes to shocks is how you mount them on the arms and tower. The only thing you realistically need to know about this is that the more you stand up the shocks, as in making them more vertical, the car will soak up bumps and big jumps a lot easier in a straight line. Unfortunately, this also causes the car to be more difficult to drive on smooth and higher grip tracks, as it will feel more twitchy and unpredictable. Meanwhile, laying down the shocks or making them more horizontal will cause the car to feel much more stable and stiff, allowing the car to feel more settled into the track, with the downside of course being the lack of bump negotiation and big up-jump absorption. Moving on to the front suspension components, we have the front caster angle. Caster is a bit harder to explain with words, but I'll try my best with the visual aid. Caster is essentially the angle at which your front suspension will compress at from starting point. The more caster you have, the more angle you'll have the front wheels compress at. I really hope this makes sense visually, but it's the best I can do. In terms of what caster actually does to your car and how it drives, well, it's actually pretty simple. The more caster your car has, as in the higher caster angle, the smoother and easier it will be to drive in both corners, and it will handle bumps better. The less caster you have, the more steering you'll get all throughout the corner from entry to exit, and it will rotate a lot faster as well. The trade-off, of course, being how your car will handle bumpy track conditions. Now, you adjust caster one of 2 ways depending on whether or not you have a C-hub car or a pillow ball car. On a C-hub car, you unfortunately have to replace the whole front C-hub in order to change the caster. On a pillow ball car, all you need to do is change the upper arm spacers to your desired caster angle. Now, there's another thing in the front suspension that many people overlook in RC, and that's your KPI, or kingpin inclination. The best way I can describe KPI is if you were to take caster and rotate it 90 degrees. Unfortunately, there aren't too many cars out there that actually allow you to change your KPI settings out of the box. Most of the time it's fixed from the factory, and they release an option part that changes it from factory. On the Miyako platform, specifically my Miyako MX-8E, there are 3 KPI settings that allow you to change the feeling of your car. Kyosho is also releasing a KPI change to their MP10 platform, and will probably change their KPI setting in their upcoming MP11 Inferno, or whatever it may be called, as well as AE with their B4.1 and B4.1E KPI kit. As for what KPI does, well, the more KPI you have, the easier and smoother the car will drive in corners. The less KPI you have, the faster the car will steal initially and off power. KPI is actually a very important part of buggy tuning, which is why I'm kind of surprised more manufacturers haven't really allowed us to mess with it. With that said, why don't we move on? Now, this section of the video I've written and rewritten a few times at this point, and each time I barely made any sense. This section relates to roll centers, so if at any point you're confused, trust me, you're not the only one. Without further delay, let's see if I can make this simple. Roll center is basically the foundation of how your car rolls in corners. When you have a high roll center, your car will feel like it's not really digging into the track, and you might even have some traction rolling issues. If you've ever heard someone say, "My car feels like it's not on the track," or "it's on the track," chances are their roll center is too high. However, having a high roll center will give you more initial grip and a higher peak amount of grip depending on your driving style. So on a lower grip track that's smooth, you may actually gain speed this way. With a lower roll center, the car will feel more physically in the track, and that's because it simply literally is. When it rolls in on a corner that you take too fast, or just in general, it will roll into the track like this, rather than rolling out of the corner like this. The main downside of running a lower roll center is that on corner exit, the car might lose traction, and it might feel a little bit lazy on a lower grip track. Now, exactly how do you change your roll center? And that's quite simple, by changing the angle, not the length, of your links, or in the case of a pillowball car, the upper and lower arms positions. For example, having a link on the lowest position of the tower and higher on the hub will give the car a very high roll center, whereas having the length on the highest position on the tower and lower on the hub will give you a very low roll center. If you have any further questions about roll center, be sure to check out these 3 videos from Max Mort, the Hall brothers, and JQ, as they go more into depth about roll center than I can, as they have more of an engineering way of explaining things. The other thing you can do with your links is lengthen them and shortening them. When you lengthen your links, you're essentially increasing the amount of leverage on that part of the car. If you lengthen the link in the rear, you'll get more stability and it'll be easier to drive. However, the car may not have as much grip coming out of a corner and may even fishtail coming out of it. If this happens, you can instead shorten the rear link, as this will allow your car to square up easier coming out of a corner. The only downside of running a shorter link is that losing traction is a much more sudden transition. The same thing applies at the front links as well. The dark arts of link lengths and roll centers is something that only really comes with time. So if you don't fully understand what I talked about, and I don't really blame you, the best way to learn is to experiment on the track during a test and tune day or before a race. The last thing I want to go over shortly is your sway bars, or more accurately named anti-roll bars. Anti-roll bars do exactly what they say in the name. They prevent the cars from rolling in a corner. The thicker the sway bar, the less the car will roll. Whereas the thinner the sway bar is, the more it will roll. Choosing which anti-roll bar to go with usually depends on the traction level of the track you're racing at. The higher the traction, the less you want your car to roll. There is a limit to this on extremely high traction surfaces like you'd see on AstroTurf or perhaps the dirt you'd see at a track like Redovon, but in the US at least, this is the case. Now, there are a few things I haven't mentioned in this video, possibly because I completely forgot about them, but also things like Ackerman plates and bump steer and other things like that I didn't mention. The things I didn't mention though, I don't find 100% necessary to tune for even more experienced drivers, as when you set them how you like, you tend to forget they even exist. If you do want to learn more about these tuning options, or perhaps the videos I made aren't detailed enough and you want more in-depth of what does what on your vehicle, I'd recommend going out and buying a setup book like Invisible Speed. Not sponsored, but if you want a very detailed and easy to understand guide on RC setup, Invisible Speed is by far one of the best you can get. This video is simply to give you a slightly better understanding and let you hit the ground running. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Also, if you want to support me another way, you have my Patreon. Speaking of which, I'd like to thank my active patrons Michael Williams, RC World Discord server, Dave Armstrong, Rob Bettingfield, Caden Merks, Ian Petrie, Buddy Howell, Jeffrey Coons, James D. Anderson, Shane T. Ruth, Gable Barber, Max some RC Hobbies, and especially Morrison Watt. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.